Like, what are some of the market incentives that can create the conditions for shifting toward a lower carbon energy production environment?
So in general, I think that like a lot of things that become politicized, there's too much focus on one number, which in this case is carbon. I think when you think about holistic use of energy, it's about price, it's about how clean is it overall. So air particulates, water usage, things like that. There's multiple variables that defines whether or not an energy source is quote unquote clean or not, and in what way, and is its impact, you know, whatever environmental impacts it might have, is it happening at the source of production? Or is it happening elsewhere? For example, mining materials and then not emitting pollutants at the source of actual on-site production. So there's also things about location and types of pollution that might be associated with energy. I think a general thing we see, and there's others that have been writing about this, I think, quite elegantly. You know, like Ross Stevens in you know, his letter in 2020 wrote about this, that basically what Bitcoin mining does is it allows humans to more readily move towards sources of stranded energy rather than always having to bring energy to us. It helps us go out and find that. And so I think one of the things that it does is incentivize capital intensive processes for like long-term energy things, because, and Alex Gladstein wrote about this too, which is that you have an environment, especially in developing countries, where they want to build an energy resource, let's say a hydroelectric dam, let's say some large capital intensive thing, and then you have a chicken and the egg problem where, you know, if you build up an energy source, the question is, are there going to be immediate buyers for all that energy that you've just spent, you know, millions and millions of dollars building out? On the other hand, if there's not enough capital to want to build out those energy production, then there's not going to be usage of that electricity either. It's like a chicken and egg problem. And so one of the things that Bitcoin mining can do is help bootstrap that. It can incentivize it as a guaranteed buyer for, say, the first few years of production, and then as other uses of energy come in, they can outbid the Bitcoin miners, because the Bitcoin miners need the cheapest electricity around. And so I think you start to see that kind of better economic incentive for it. And I think then the role becomes, there's so many jurisdictions in the world, and energy gets tied into government policies and things like that. We see, for example, windfall taxes on excessive energy production. We see you know, things that try to incentivize one type of energy over another, and they might not be based on technology, they might be based on perception. I think like a really big thing that we're seeing is that there's just not a lot of understanding out there.
Yeah.
So for example, even in Texas, even in different places you think would embrace it quicker, you still find political opposition to it.
Yeah.
And when you dive in, and I've talked to a number of miners about this, for example, you actually see competitors trying to muddle the narrative.
Yep.
So for example, on one hand, you have Bitcoin miners pointing out, hey, you know, we're highly mobile, highly flexible consumers of electricity.
Yeah.
We can make use of it. Like if you're producing too much variable sources, we can absorb some of that. If you have these always on sources like nuclear power or hydropower and you're not using all of it, you're not monetizing it properly, we can come in and soak up the rest of it. So on that hand, you have those types of arguments. But on the other hand, you have competitors, right? So you have, for example, you can have companies that operate battery farms, or companies that operate natural gas peaking plants. They want to be the demand response. And so one thing that they can do is they can come in and say, you know, actually, Bitcoin mining is bad for X, Y, Z, and we're going to donate to politicians and try to put our solution there instead if they can't compete with Bitcoin miners directly. And I think that's something that we're seeing in a number of locations, including Texas. And it'd be interesting to see which jurisdictions are able to kind of bypass that type of political opposition. Because in the long arc of time, you would think that the most technological solution should win out from market forces, but then it becomes a question of how long does it take for certain entrenched interests to slowly get kind of chipped away. And I think that, you know, whether you look at, I think overall one of the big problems is people just don't understand it.
Yeah.
You know, Bitcoin enough, like, we all even saw debates, like the debate just happened before us, right? That's a technical problem.
Right.
And if you look at, say, macro circles, it's like mostly completely off their radar. Same thing happens with energy, right? When you see the energy talking points that are out there in terms of like that New York Times piece, or you see it in politics, it's such a low surface understanding of how both Bitcoin works and how electricity works. And that, like, gap is just completely unaddressed.
Yep.
And I think that there's so much more work to do about educating people. One is about how electricity is consumed and produced, and then how Bitcoin uses energy. Because when people actually see the numbers, like I've generally found that when you actually talk to politicians, you actually talk to policymakers, you actually kind of walk them through step by step how this works. In private, they tend to get it. Even in public, when they're limited to sound bites and they're limited to themes and things like that, it's very easy to gloss over the details.